This will be the topic analysis for the September-October LD topic, which is resolved. The United States ought to require that workers receive a living wage. So first, let's talk about the definitions. The United States is also known as the United States federal government, who is the actor of the resolution. The second definition is ought, which denotes a moral obligation specific to LD. And the third definition is a living wage. And this is more of an ambiguous legal definition, but the most common one says that a wage that covers a worker's basic necessities such as food, healthcare, and water is constituted by a living wage. And usually a living wage is location dependent. And so if you go to this website, you can calculate the hypothetical living wage on where you live, because different areas have different costs of living. So, for example, someone living in California would have a higher living wage than someone that lives in Kansas, for example, because all of the living wages are calculated based on inflation, the taxes, and the prices of certain goods in an area. So, let's talk about the affirmative ground. The first contention that's the most intuitive is inequality, because by providing a living wage for the majority or all workers in the United States, it would increase their wages, and thus they would have more financial flexibility to get access to adequate living conditions such as proper healthcare, food, and housing. And the interesting thing about a living wage is that it's not directly provided by the government, but rather the companies. And so you have to make the argument that the companies, even if they give a living wage for their workers, would still be able to stay afloat. And I think that leads us into the second affirmative contention, which is economic productivity. The argument here is that when workers can work less jobs for the same amount of money because they're getting paid more under a living wage, that would decrease burnout and increase productivity. And the important thing to note is that although companies may not have the affordability in the short term to provide a living wage, in the long run, it would provide a sense of resiliency to that exact same company. Because when people work more, they can produce more goods for the economy, and thus they'll sell more goods, earning more of a profit. And so the argument that you want to make as the affirmative is that no matter how expensive a living wage could be for a specific company, it would still provide long-term growth and resiliency because it's seen as an investment, and so you need to pour in money right now in order to see results in the future. So now let's talk about negative ground. The first negative contention is small businesses. And the idea is that when small businesses have to pay a living wage, they would go bankrupt immediately because now they have to suddenly pay their workers a much more expensive wage. And so kind of going back to the affirmative side, when the AF says that it's a form of long-term investment, your job as the negative is to prove why small businesses are never going to be able to pay their workers a living wage in the first place. And so they would just go out of business. And if you pair that argument with another statistic of how important small businesses are to the economy, then you would have an extremely big economy push, because you can argue that the majority of the small businesses that are key to increase competition inside of the market and thus decrease monopolization by large corporations. Under a world of the affirmative, you would see all these big corporations that are able to pay a living wage, but all of the small businesses going completely bankrupt. And so you would see much more monopolies, in which case the majority of prices would just be hiked because the monopolies can control everything as they wish. The second negative contention is inflation. And the idea is twofold. The first is that you're increasing the consumer spending power. And the second is that you're forcing companies to raise prices in order to make up for the lost costs. And so this causes a cyclical pattern known as a wage price spiral. If you increase the number of consumers that can buy your product, but at the same time your company needs to pay your workers even more, the companies would have to jack up their prices in order to make up for the losses in terms of paying their workers a lot more. And at the same time, there's more people that are willing to buy your products. And so this positive feedback loop would lead to more people having the ability to pay and companies having to jack up their prices. And at the same time, that would all create inflation on both hands. And so inflation isn't just one part increasing. It's a loop, in which case more consumers means more demand, and also companies having to pay a living wage have to again raise their prices. And you can argue that this would lead to hyperinflation, in which case the entire economy is going to completely shut down, and different sectors across the US economy are also going to be negatively affected.